Ótimo. Bom dia, gente. Desculpem esses problemas técnicos, acontecem, estão para além das nossas habilidades, né? Então, agora, oficialmente, damos início a essa sessão do evento. Eu me chamo Luiz Helena Hilgert, sou pós-doutoranda em Filosofia pela UFSCar, FAPESP, e organizo este Ciclo Internacional de Conferências, a Fenomenologia entre Tempos e Lugares, junto com o meu amigo e colega André Dias. Sejam todos e todas muito bem-vindos e muito bem-vindas a esta nossa quarta sessão de conferências. Ontem, dia 23 de junho, nós tivemos conferências sobre os fundamentos teóricos da fenomenologia e as suas possíveis atualizações, também as aplicações dos seus conceitos e discussões envolvendo a política, o espaço social, com uma abordagem fenomenológica do espaço e da atenção, sobretudo nestes ambientes virtuais nos quais nós nos encontramos aqui e agora, inclusive. Agora, eu gostaria de apresentar a nossa conferencista dessa sessão, a doutora Dorothea Olkowski. Infelizmente, a nossa mesa matutina deste dia 24 de junho não contará com a presença da conferencista Florence Cailmet, mas nós seremos presenteados com a conferência da pesquisadora Dorothea Olkowski, que é professora da Universidade de Colorado, nos Estados Unidos. O seu trabalho envolve uma vasta gama de interesses filosóficos, da fenomenologia ao pós-estruturalismo, da ética ao feminismo. É autora, editora de 13 livros, de mais de 100 artigos, dentre os mais recentes, Philosophy of Freedom, Freedom's Refrains, Deleuze, Bergson and Merleau-Ponty, The Logics and Pragmatics of Affect, Perception and Creation. É membro do Comitê Diretor da Rede Internacional de Mulheres Filósofas da Unesco e diretora do Programa de Estudos Cognitivos Interdisciplinares da Universidade de Colorado. A professora fará sua conferência em inglês. Nós fizemos a tradução, o André gentilmente fez a tradução do texto da professora Dorothea e nós exibiremos na tela. Welcome, Professor Dorothea Olkowski. Good morning and be welcome. Could you please start over?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I will do that. No problem, no problem. Okay, so the paper is Man the Hero, ? On the limits of perception for social interaction in Merleau-Ponty. The introduction. In philosophy, problems posed by the concept of freedom, when they are not reduced to simplistic opposition of determinism versus indeterminism, are often assumed to be primarily ethical. But in his perceptual phenomenology, Maurice Merleau-Ponty stands out for not conceptualizing freedom in either of these traditional ways. In fact, he inaugurates an original approach when he argues that questions about choice must take their place in the lived context of temporal, social, and historical aspects of human relations. This appears to be because in his perceptual analysis, the human organism as a living present is open, not merely to the past and future, but also to temporalities outside of lived experience, including those of the environment and the social horizon, as a field of relations within which all choices take place. These fields of relations are articulated by Merleau-Ponty in a number of ways. They can be found in the Gestalt perceptual structure, whereby certain shapes are favored, such as cubes or groupings of dots in pairs of 6. But he also examines the fields of relations which he takes to be fundamental to our historical connections, as well as those organizing our connections to the physical world. They are understood as our way of being in the world within a variety of frameworks. So, for example, there is his well-known statement that in Russia, 1917, becoming revolutionary could not have been the having been confronted with a representation of revolution, since more than likely no Russian peasant ever expressly advocated the transfer of property to the state, which, as he notes, might have been the terrifying projects were generalized as revolutionary. If this is how it happens, he asserts, it's because there is a molecular process and not a molar mechanical causality operating to produce the transformations of social and political life. And although the molecular process takes place on the level of the relations that human beings have with one another and with their own lives, it nevertheless operates nearly invisibly. Molecular processes presume coexistence, but these descriptions do not provide a clear understanding of what a molecular process is and how it can be relevant for our relations with others and with ourselves. That is, how it structures our temporal, social, and political lives. This concept, the idea of molecular processes, is provocative, but does not immediately rise to the surface of Merleau-Ponty's thought. I mean, we will have to look to some lesser known aspects of his philosophy to make sense of this idea and to arrive at some conclusions regarding the role it plays and to determine if and how it arises conceptually in our experience. So let's begin with Merleau-Ponty's typology of heroes, which yields both a critique of non-relational approaches to our problem and an entry into the molecular processes that organize our social and political relations. And I note this is a text very few people know. 4 types of heroes. In the essay Man the Hero, Merleau-Ponty describes 4 different conceptions of what it is to be a hero in a world where he feels that, quote, heroes are fading away and protests, which are cautious today, but tomorrow, in this post-World War I world, and apparently in the midst of the Second World War as well, Merleau-Ponty cites a man of letters, a former hero, who expresses a strong preference for even a, quote, grain of wisdom, intelligence, and reason, and a distrust of heroes and heroism. So what about all of this? Is there still a place for heroes in Merleau-Ponty's lifetime, and what about our own? If some sort of hero remains possible, we have to ask which version of the hero, if any, does Merleau-Ponty endorse, and how can this concept be used to ground his concept of the molecular? In our own time, even before the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 2021, in the United States, one often heard of individuals being designated as heroes. This is really something in the US. I don't know about elsewhere. Soldiers enlisted in various services in the US were frequently called heroes and thanked again and again for their service and given the option to board planes ahead of other passengers. More ordinary individuals such as police, firefighters, good Samaritans, and individuals who perform such exceptional deeds like landing a plane full of passengers, thanks for their services and skill. With the coronavirus, which, and we cannot pretend, of course, when I wrote this, it really hadn't yet happened, but it has happened now. It has spread to nearly everywhere on Earth and is likely to persist as problematic long into the future in spite of cures and vaccines. The new heroes are generally in this order: doctors, nurses, emergency services workers, elderly care workers, grocery store workers, bus drivers, security workers, and a random scattering of others perceived to be risking their lives for the sake of the rest of us. Police may have once been part of this list, but in the US, the movement against systemic police violence seems to have put their heroic status in question, although lately, because of what happened January 6th in the United States with the Capitol Police being attacked, this has shifted slightly already. With this in mind, it makes as much sense now as during Merleau-Ponty's lifetime to ask what or who is a hero, and how does this relate to the molecular and molar aspects of temporal, social, and political change. Merleau-Ponty offers us 4 different approaches, 4 conceptions of the hero, those of Hegel, Nietzsche, Hemingway, finally that of Saint-Exupéry. Each performs through their writing, and where in their writing, where to speak or to write is to act, was formative conception. A different version, each performs a different version or vision of the hero, their motives, and the world they inhabit. We can use these 4 versions both to assess Merleau-Ponty's understanding of the hero and to understand the social and political relations defined by each of these types. First, he believes that the emergence of the hero is a symptom of the decline of religious affirmation of an afterlife, and of the idea that greatness comes with being chosen by God. So for Merleau-Ponty, Hegel represents a unique turning point. Yet Hegel designates only the individual, the hero, the one who is first to understand that the current system of laws and moral structures has no future, and so forsakes his or her own happiness to, quote, create a law and a moral system in which their time will later recognize its truth, end quote. Making a future for others with whom they currently share no relations, the Hegelian hero interprets the meaning of history by drawing on a, quote, underground source of the inner spirit, whose content is hidden and not yet broken through the surface of actual existence, end quote. Unfortunately, this objective has its own limitations, namely that once the hero master has succeeded, he is a master to slaves who must continue to risk death in the search for others to conquer, even though they too will be unable to recognize him as the hero, but only as the master. Thus, in the end, for Hegel, the real hero ends up being the slave who chooses life, working to transform the world into one without a master, and so not a product of what Merleau-Ponty understands to be molecular relations. Superseding Hegel, Nietzsche proposes the Superman as a new type of hero, one who, according to Merleau-Ponty, is interested in power and only power. But this pure power is not directed to any specific enterprise, and so it asserts itself the only way it can. It's directed against something, someone or something currently power, or it seeks somehow to conquer death by negating any intent that has been carried out. This somewhat nihilistic and apparently anti-existentialist approach to social and political relations also holds little interest for Merleau-Ponty as he quickly moves on to the next type. Next, the focus is on Robert Jordan, the hero of Ernest Hemingway's novel The Golf Wolves, whom Merleau-Ponty calls, quote, the hero of our contemporaries, and who believes in liberty, equality, and fraternity, as well as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and not Marxism. It comes down to the question of motives, and Jordan's motives propel him to act for the sake of his own freedom, not molecularly in relationship to others. He appears to be what we might now call, at least in the US, a libertarian. Current US libertarians proclaim freedom to be their single issue, and they characterize it as respect for individual rights, the exclusion of force and fraud. Specifically, they argue for freedom from taxation, free markets, including for education and healthcare, equal rights, criminal justice reforms, opposition to nation building, the unfettered right to bear arms, and somewhat surprisingly, an end to the war on drugs and open borders for immigration. Robert Jordan, a fictional hero of the Spanish Civil War, appears to embody many of these individualistic characteristics. rejecting communism precisely because it requires giving up freedom of choice. Fourth and final type of hero in Merleau-Ponty's account is the author of Pilote de Guerre, that is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry himself, whose recollection of his multiple, essentially useless reconnaissance flights over France in the face of the overwhelming numbers of German fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns is the backdrop for this new concept of the hero. According to Merleau-Ponty, what makes Saint-Exupéry a hero is a distinctly human moment, defined by his, quote, loyalty to the natural movement which flings us towards things and towards others. This purely relational hero is situated in relation to others, even as he is uniquely distinguished from them, as he clarifies the meaning of his heroic choices. What sets him apart is narrated in the pilot's memory of his flow of conscious thought. It is quite like the structure of lived experience articulated by the philosopher. It does not appear in any other version of the hero's tale, and therefore gives a much more significant role to Saint-Exupéry's hero's story, and can be seen to play a central role in Merleau-Ponty's conception of the molecular structure of the temporal, social, and political relations. The molecular hero. Saint-Exupéry and his crew are reluctantly assigned to an impossible sortie by their superior officer, one almost certain to end badly for them. He accepts it without hesitation, and as someone whose frequent view of humanity is from several thousand feet above the ground, he begins to reflect on man in general. What is this reflection? The spirit, he thinks, is intermittent, but there is something that is constant, that it is the life of the mind. Spirit is the faculty that relates one object to another according to their significance, but which also alternates between vision and blindness, which limits the power of the spirit. And so, what we call a nation is certainly not the sum of regions, customs, cities, farms, and the rest that man's intelligence is able at any moment to add up. It is a being. But there are moments, he says, when I find myself blind to beings. When one is blind to beings, what is left is something like particles in the universe of chaos. And beings are only, quote, details in a vast structure to see the whole, of which demanded more time, more silence, more perspective. More perspective, that is, than that of the military officer, the major, who was forced to assign this impossible mission to Saint-Exupéry, more than this major could possibly have obtained, but others can. Thinking of man in general, Saint-Exupéry posits the situation of a friend who has died and whose funeral you, or actually he, must take care of. It brings, quote, instantly into being a whole new network of relations between you and the ideas, the desires, the habits of the man now dead, unquote. This event is not just the demise of a single individual, but it has actually rearranged the world, rearranged all the relations in the world, even though the one who is busy with the many details of the funeral is not yet aware of this, and so does not have the perspective needed to become aware of it. Not until the day after the burial, the silence is everywhere and the friend is nowhere. The silence is required in order to get beyond the sum of particles in chaos. Silence in order for the ideas, habits, and desires of another to appear, and for that person to be reconstructed as absent. Inhabiting his flight here, Saint-Exupéry undergoes the same reduction of the universe of beings to particles in the universal chaos. He undergoes a moment of timelessness in the sense of being released from human events. It is the beginning of anguish. There is no God, no face to love, no France or Europe, only particles and detritus. he undergoes too a loss of human identity. And he can restart the flow of time by taking up the myriad details required to fly the plane or bury the dead. But this does not yet restore a human identity. It is no more than duty, games, and the passing of time. In the cockpit, the instrumentation orients itself around the pilot, who becomes an organism integrated into the plane, and who begins to feel a filial affection for it. There is physical pleasure in carrying out required actions, yet the plane goes off course, evading the town of Albert, where the pilot had been told the German planes and anti-aircraft await, so that the town is categorically blocked. In this case, it is the body that reacts. The warning about the village of Albert has activated the pilot's bodily memory of past crashes, of nights in the hospital, of fractures. But his own self lies in some imagined future, where he might be able to walk alone on the highway that runs through his village as it pulses with life and not war. Against his own body, Saint-Exupéry is preparing himself for his vision of the whole, the invisible structure, as he calls it, in which or out of which he will find himself, quote, that other within me. At 32,000 feet, Earth looks empty. Humans cease to exist, leaving behind only traces such as highways, canals, convoys, and barges. At that altitude, the pilot is a glacial scientist, freezing cold, and the war is his experiment with particles in the chaos. The question that all of Saint-Exupéry's experiences evoked is, how does Merleau-Ponty take up and inhabit the structure? There are particles in chaos, meaning randomly arranged, lacking signification, as well as continuity of the analytic mind, logic and science, the stopping and starting of time, the focus on detail, the body that remembers, and the hope for the reemergence of oneself, the other within me. As well, there is man in general, being and not beings, timelessness, and the loss of human identity. Where will all of this take us, philosophers? The personal. Brian Smith, who is a wonderful philosopher, by the way, to whom this essay owes a debt for his recognition of the role of Saint-Exupéry's influence on Merleau-Ponty's conception of generality and anonymity, provides the backdrop and the infill for these questions. According to Smith, quote, Merleau-Ponty sought to show that history as a totality is something of which we are, or at least can be, aware of on the pre-reflective level of lived perception. In other words, that historical totality is a lived perception. That is, I want to say, central to Merleau-Ponty's argument. The general formula for this awareness is Marxism, insofar as it exemplifies the, quote, Gestalt totality that maintains the identity of subjective and objective factors, while still remaining oriented to truth in a universal sense. This is a surprising conclusion. Nevertheless, Smith argues that it is the pre-personal or impersonal aspect of humanity, the habitual body, that, quote, impersonal corporeal anchorage, which represses or deactualizes the actual body, the first-person existence, and returns us to the anonymous existence, the one. Smith takes this further by claiming that for Merleau-Ponty, the repression of personal life to the anonymous, habituated organism belongs to its, quote, selfless tendency towards universal life. And this is exemplified in the heroism of the author of Pilote de Guerre, in the moments in which the pilot, the glacial scientist, is blind to beings and is left to what he called particles in the universe. So far, so good. What follows is that Merleau-Ponty links Saint-Exupéry's generality, the selfless tendency towards universal life, to the historical a priori governmental action in that context. This, to the extent there are forms of action geared toward the concrete realization of the latent universal content of existing structures. In this case, Smith argues, it supports an incarnational Marxism because we already embody collectively and impersonally the fundamental structures of universal reconciliation. The revolutionary task of Marxism is only, quote, to realize the already tacitly embodied structures more fully at the level of actual embodied existence, end quote. If so, then would it not be the case that the lack of an adequate existential phenomenology is all that keeps us from the universal reconciliation of all humanity? Does the anonymous level of existence actually make such an outcome possible? If it is possible, the groundwork for such an outcome is set down early in Merleau-Ponty's work, in the structure of behavior, and it is amplified in the phenomenology of perception. In the former, he argues against the Pavlovian conception of stimulus and response in favor of a view of behavior as a function of the situation as it is for the organism. In short, there is an a priori for every species defined by the relations efficacious for it and the manner in which it elaborates those stimuli, creating a distinct structural reality. This is what he later refers to as molecular relations. In these environments or milieu, stimuli signify according to, quote, what they are worth for the typical activity of the species, which is an internal unity, a kinetic melody gifted with meaning. Responses carry an immanent intelligibility, a form of behavior. Most of these descriptions appear to refer to non-human animal behavior, but we must ask ourselves, given the above, if this is really the case, or if, for Merleau-Ponty, they might not also be applicable to human acts. There is nothing in this account that excludes the human species. The only thing that differentiates the human from other species is the preponderance of the mental field in addition to the physical and physiological field. But matter, life, and mind are nevertheless universally applicable categories, since even the soap bubble, the object of the physical sciences, behaves in the manner of an organism because, quote, what happens at each point is predetermined by what happens at all the others. There is an immanent intelligibility independent of language. There is, Merleau-Ponty adds, a certain value and significance, a question of intelligibility, even for physical form, even for the operations of an ellipsoid conductor in which electrical charges have been placed. The theory of form must be liberated from realistic postulates of psychology along with materialism and mentalism. There can be only one universe, not that of physical cause and effect, but that of form, a general, universal, and therefore anonymous arrangement of each field or structure in the world. The anonymous and the human. Like the physiological form, physical form follows its own immanent law. As a whole, Merleau-Ponty affirms there is a molar individual, an individual that acts on or by means of large masses or units, large by comparison with the discernible elements or physical particles that make it up. The particles in a physical field distribute themselves within that field in relation to external forces acting on them. But the laws of physics govern the properties of relatively stable wholes or molar individuals and not particles. This language is echoed by Saint-Exupéry's description of particles in chaos, where chaos refers to the possibility of multiple forms of organization contrasted with the planned and built environments of the universe of beings. So we have the chaos of being, with a capital B, and the human organized world of beings. And beyond the silence of the universe of chaotic particles, among the banal milieu of myriad details that must be attended to, there is the fact that the world has been rearranged by the absence of the departed friend. Quote, around the human world that each of us has fashioned, there appears a general world to which we must first belong in order to be able to enclose ourselves within a particular milieu of a love or an ambition. For Merleau-Ponty, the human organism is simultaneously a pre-personal adhesion to a general form, the anonymous and general existence that acts as an innate complex below the level of personal life. And personal existence represses or sublimates this anonymous and general existence as the cultural world sublimates the natural world. Yet the latter always reassert themselves like the flow of time in relation to our present moments. The anonymous generality is both freedom and servitude, and this is because, as noted above, there is an a priori for every species defined by the relations efficacious for it, and the manner in which it elaborates those stimuli lead to the creation of a distinct structural reality. As Merleau-Ponty argues, vision, hearing, sexuality, and the body are not merely points of passage, instruments, or manifestations of personal existence. Personal existence takes them up and gathers them in their given and anonymous existence, which, as we have seen, is the universe of form that is physical, physiological, and mental, or symbolic, all at once. As I noted above, anonymous existence is linked to time, specifically to natural time, the power that prevents the voluntary and rational life and the rationality of one's history from being completed by opening it to an absolutely new future. But the anonymous life also threatens the present, insofar as no human constitutes it, but culturally descends into it, like, quote, footprints in the sand. Yet, as Merleau-Ponty continues, although it might surprise us, the acts through which human beings constitute their lives, the tools of every civilization and society, also become sedimented and lead to an anonymous existence as things, discoverable even in the ruins of an archaeological site. That is, quote, in the cultural object I experience the mere presence of others under the veil of anonymity. One uses the pipe, the spoon, the bell. Merleau-Ponty is eager to explain how it is that we understand even ancient civilization without resorting to analogizing them to ourselves, and thereby placing a privilege constituting consciousness at the center of the world. What he wants is a, quote, general idea of the I, grasped in the mode of the one. But this is possible only if each individual is first a pre-personal subject in a pre-personal or neutral world, undivided between the perception of individuals and worlds, which then slip into one another and are gathered together in a world consisting of anonymous ones, variations of the one world, like the world inhabited by little children. There is one more element in this structure. Marked on the borders of our own history, there exists the place, at least if you're French anyway, the place of the Athenian Republic or the Roman Empire, indeterminate yet pre-existing, so that each of us may find the fundamental structures of history in our own lives. As Smith argues, like the world of particles and the world of perception, the social world exists, pre-exists silently and as a solicitation. History is always already universally present, indeterminate and vague, but there. Saint-Exupéry's particles are truly in chaos, however. They are not organized into the multiplicity of human activities and objects. They are truly general. They are beings, not beings. Merleau-Ponty's are not the same as Saint-Exupéry's. He maintains that, quote, the question is always to know how I can be open to phenomena that transcend me, and that nevertheless only exist to the extent that I take them up and live them. While this is certainly the case for time, for the temporality of the world, Is it also the case that history and the social world exist for us as an ambiguous presence prior to any specific recollection? The movement of history from Merleau-Ponty, the creation of an artist is like the creation of an artist, an intention creating its instruments and its means of expression. Both are prepared by a molecular process, which, as we have seen, is organized by molar forces so that it bursts forth as an intentionality in general. So for Merleau-Ponty, when Cézanne says that what he is doing is returning to the object, Merleau-Ponty shows him to be painting its arrival as matter taking on form, manifesting the birth of order, a spontaneous organization. And so it is for history, halos of generality, atmospheres of sociality, social existence prior to every personal decision. But if instead of social existence, one encounters the structures, for example, set out by Marx, and a different picture emerges. First, there are nomads wandering the earth, their great workshop, then the commune of peasants, which into the organization of guilds until the state arises and emerges as the inscription of the collection of all the forces and agents of production, the old inscribed on the new, manifest as major work projects, extorted surplus value, tributes, and generalized servitude. Nothing of Merleau-Ponty's idealized picture of the pre-personal being ready for revolution can be found in this. So perhaps it is here that we encounter the limits of the phenomenology of perception's conception of structures and forms that are supposed to set us free from our first-person existence, from our irrefutable certainties and knowledge, and confirm that we are structures open to the world and others. In the physical realm, apart from molar form, particles exist chaotically, randomly, and disorganized. This would then undermine the claim that the physical, physiological, and symbolic worlds exist for us as an ambiguous presence prior to any specific recollection, but nevertheless pre-exists us so that each of us will seamlessly reveal the fundamental structures of social and historical life in our own lives. So let us now return to the words of the author of Pilote de Guerre, the moments in which he becomes the glacial scientist, blind to beings, and undergoing the transformation of the universe of beings to particles in the universal chaos. Recall his timelessness, his release from human events, his loss of human identity, and his anguish at 33,000 feet, where there is no God, no face to love, no France or Europe, only particles and detritus. Recall how the chaos of being takes over, even as his own self lies in some imagined future when he might be able to walk alone on the highway that runs through his village as it pulses with life, exempt from war. Saint-Exupéry did not dream of revolution, and he did not even live to become his own so-called self. He died when his plane crashed into the deep waters of the Mediterranean Sea, returning forever to the anonymous and pre-personal existence in the chaos of being, never a hero to himself, always a glacial scientist. Thank you very much.
Você volta, André, eu volto.
Eu posso voltar desligando meus dois microfones aqui e você desliga os seus dois, ó.
I can't hear these questions, so you have to give them to me.
Right. Se alguém tiver questões e escrever no chat, nós estamos fazendo o possível para juntar todos os dispositivos aqui e fazer essa apresentação ocorrer. Não está sendo fácil, mas de fato, esse eu consegui ouvir aqui e é um texto, uma apresentação que valeu muito a pena. Enquanto o pessoal pensa em questões, a gente traduz para a professora Dorothea e, em seguida, traduz tanto quanto possível, acho que assim como a nossa relação com a tecnologia, para vocês de volta. Eu vou fazer uma questão a respeito deste texto do Merleau-Ponty, pouco conhecido, e muito bonito, a respeito da figura do herói, e vou perguntar a respeito da importância, se ela existe, da figura do vilão nos dias de hoje. So, Professor Dorothea, I thank you. I'm very glad for this text and presentation, that it make our event very rich, and not only because the approach that you make of Merleau-Ponty, that for me is very singular, but also for rescuing this barely known text, and most beautiful for me, man, the hero. I was thinking about this condition of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, that seems to me that he can see his human condition and becomes not human at some extent, or as Merleau-Ponty himself writes in Éloge de la Philosophie, we are more or less human than we are. Yet I ask, and even for that, I ask about the figure of the villain. I don't know if I am pronouncing it correctly. The villain, the antagonist, not the hero, in our days, because I think that perhaps it's the villain nowadays that can create a true convergence of different political, ethical, and human forces, and not the hero and the human. After all, for instance, here in Brazil, we have a multicultural and very political forces, such as in on the parties and the social movements, and most of them doesn't agree and will not agree one with another, but they are converging, not to with not around a project of future or a project of political project, but against this figure of I think not a hero but a villain, just to in order to maybe just stay alive for another month or two. We are very glad to stay alive in our situation, in our present situation, and so if you with all this theory background, can please tell to us something about how can we think about the villain, maybe with the hero, against the hero. I think that even maybe the villain is, after all, theoretically speaking, the transcendental conscience, after all, that make a true convergence of forces and not the reconciliation. Well, I don't know if I
think I can try to answer. First of all, I want to be very clear that my interest in Conferência is because he rejects the whole idea of a hero, and I agree with him. And so, right, so I'm not, so I think, you know, even though Merleau-Ponty is trying to rethink the notion of hero in a much, on a basis of the anonymous one, what I try to argue is that it fails. That, anyway, for me, it fails. There might be some other Merleau-Pontians who would argue that I'm wrong, but for me it fails. Especially when you look at it from the point of view of Saint-Exupéry. And along that same line, to begin to discuss the villain is the same as discussing the hero. And so I had a discussion like this recently with someone about anarchy and anarchism. And the problem for me with, and I only began to realize that the problem for me with all of our social and political positioning is, to some extent, we do take it to arise out of some pre-personal, impersonal, historical, social, and political life. And let's just take an area where it's easy to see, and that would be in the environment, right, which we're, on the basis of our social and political struggles, destroying. But from the point of view of someone like Saint-Exupéry, right, it's not a question of engaging in all those social and political struggles in order to resolve the problem. It's a question of reformulating it in a different way on the basis of, you know, from his point of view, understanding nature itself, the nature of, you know, chaos and chaotic structures and the unpredictability of all organizations, as opposed to when we engage in some political act, we think we can predict the outcome. And, you know, for someone like Saint-Exupéry, we're fooling ourselves. So he gets this mission which he feels it will kill him. It didn't, he survived it. But, you know, he takes it anyway. And the person who gives him this mission thinks it will kill him, and he doesn't want to kill him, but, you know, there's this on the ground, there's a struggle, so he says, yeah, go. But from his position, you know, 3,000 miles up in the air, he sees something different. He understands humanity in a very different way. And so even though, yes, he obeys the human order, it's not, he doesn't go up there saying, oh, I need to be the hero. I need to kill the villains. I need to act against all those bad guys. He just goes up there right in the plane and he does the job he's assigned to do. And he realizes, right, that to a certain extent, the outcome, you know, it's not in his personal hands. It's in no one's personal hands. It's an aggregation of forces that are often outside of and beyond that are always outside and beyond our control. And so, you know, our struggles to act politically, and I don't mean to be nihilistic about this, but there's a certain sense in which if we see ourselves in opposition, in oppositional struggles, it's going to fail. So I'm arguing that we need a new epistemology for social and political action. We need to approach it right? From 3,000 feet up. We need to understand also that the nature of reality on the physical level, which we are part of, is that every starting point has an unanticipated outcome. Every starting point has an unanticipated outcome. And we have to remain completely open to that set of problems. So this is just sort of like, I painted a small picture of a much larger issue, what I take to be a much larger issue. I just tried to put it in language that we we could see one picture, and then we could understand that, right? That's just that little picture describes something much larger, which would take a lot more work to describe.
André, será que eu posso fazer uma pergunta e depois você traduz as duas respostas de uma vez por causa dessa inversão de microfone? Pode ser? Faz assim? Faz assim. Tá. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking and original lecture. And thank you very much for showing that Saint-Exupéry is more than the little prince. And thank you again for your patience with our technological inability.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm so honored. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for your interest.
I would ask if this passage, a short aspect of your text, this passage against Pavlov, is a kind of phenomenalization of behavior, or still is a way of naturalizing the being. I don't know if you understand me, but this is a very little passage on your text about the behavior structure of Merleau-Ponty. Yeah.
You know, Merleau-Ponty is critical of behaviorists, of course. I really think that the structure of behavior is actually the structure of everything Merleau-Ponty wrote, everything. And that's why very often in my papers and books, I go back to it. And I think those three structures, right, the physical, the biological, and the mental, I think they are behind everything he does in life. And so that in his work. And the question is how non-physical is his thinking if you privilege the idea of structure? And I admit I've had to dance around this. I suspect that there's a kind of idealism operating here, which I don't actually object to idealism, idealism is maybe the wrong word. I mean, he wants to undo, he doesn't want to fall into the hole of physicalist theories, right? He doesn't want physicalist ideas, which is why he rejects Pavlov appropriately. And he rejects physicalism in general. But it's unclear how that with structure, creating a new physics. And he doesn't create new physics, but I think other philosophers who come after him do search for a new physics. I think, for example, not even those who come after him, but I think, Bergson was much more attuned to a new physics than Merleau-Ponty is. And I think it limits, to some extent, some of his ideas. On the other hand, I know there is a place for his work, and I know there is a place for the value of the phenomenology of experience. I don't want to discard it, and I absolutely don't want to discard it, but I think that it fits in with other theories. I would situate him as someone who offers a piece of the puzzle and the rest of it needs to be filled in with other ideas, other theories from other philosophers. But then I think that about everybody. There's no one philosopher who has answered all the questions for us, thank God. Otherwise, we would all be, instead of doing philosophy, it would be like church,
Yeah.
And we don't need church, we need philosophy. and we need people to create new ideas, you know.
Right.
And if it was all done and it was correct, what would be the point? There'd be no point in us doing this. So to make Saint-Exupéry a philosopher who solves a problem that Merleau-Ponty can't solve, that's important. You know, it doesn't mean you discard Merleau-Ponty, it just means Saint-Exupéry accidentally, without even trying, solved a different problem. Solve the problem. You know?
Thank you.
Okay, I will briefly translate the answers because they are so rich. Okay, I will briefly translate. Bem, eu perguntei, né, sobre a questão do vilão, a professora, e ela me respondeu que, na verdade, se trata de... O Merleau-Ponty já ele desmontava a figura do herói, em certa medida se movia contra ela, né? E a questão é trazer o ponto de vista deste herói, entre aspas, que é o Saint-Exupéry, algo que ela já discutiu em outros momentos com colegas dela a respeito de um ponto de vista anarquista e da filosofia da história, a partir do qual não se trata de imediatamente se engajar e resolver os problemas políticos, isso no texto dela, mas do ponto de vista mas reformular eles, então uma reformulação dos problemas políticos, dos problemas de liberdade, engajamento, heroísmo, a partir do ponto de vista da natureza e do caos. É assim que ela toma tanto o texto do Merleau-Ponty quanto o livro O Pilote de Guerre, né, do Saint-Exupéry. Então, não se trata de pensar explicitamente o que fazer com o nosso futuro. O Saint-Exupéry, ele vai à morte, vai para uma missão suicida, ele sabe que pode morrer e vai mesmo assim. A ideia dele não é querer ser herói, não é querer matar os caras maus, the bad guys, né? Como ela disse. Ele sabe que ele não tem o destino inteiro, o desdobramento das suas ações nas mãos dele. E a questão, então, como um todo, para fechar, é que nós falhamos se nós tentamos ter todo o desdobramento das nossas ações, o destino em nossas mãos, né? Se a gente consegue. Porque o que acontece? Mesmo toda teoria tem um desdobramento que ela não antecipa. Ela não antecipa completamente. Então, como ela disse, trata de trazer à tona, por meio dessa figura, algo que ela vai também recuperar na resposta que ela deu a Luísa. A Luísa perguntou entre as relações da passagem do Pavlov, né, do psicólogo, e que levaria a uma naturalização do ser, da consciência, com relação ao Merleau-Ponty, que, como a professora Dorothea disse, ele é muito crítico com relação a essa perspectiva do Pavlov, né? E ela sempre recupera essa crítica em vários dos trabalhos dela, trazendo à tona a ideia justamente de estrutura, de forma, né? Que está presente desde a estrutura do comportamento, o primeiro livro do Merleau-Ponty. O Merleau-Ponty rejeita o fisicalismo, mas, segundo a professora, na época dele rejeitava o fisicalismo, e Pavlov, né, como um dos tributários, né, dessa perspectiva. Mas o que o que acontece é que após o fisicalismo se criou uma nova física, e de fato os trabalhos mais recentes dela envolvem a teoria do caos, a mecânica quântica em relação à filosofia. Eu digo para todo mundo pesquisar os trabalhos dela, que vale a pena. E aí, para terminar, ela diz: a fenomenologia da experiência, tal como a do Merleau-Ponty, ela tem um lugar em toda essa descrição bastante contemporânea, bastante rica, bastante complexa, que se faz, mas como uma espécie de peça, como ela diz, e um grande quebra-cabeça, né, em a puzzle. E aí o que acontece? Porque toda teoria ela não consegue totalizar e não consegue antecipar completamente os seus desdobramentos, senão ela faria de si mesma uma igreja. E eu creio que neste ponto ambas as respostas elas se aproximam, né? Se não houver mais uma questão aqui, eu acho que não tem, né? Eu faria uma questão final para ela, porque eu quero muito aproveitar a oportunidade. I want to make just one more question, and this will be the very briefly. There's some resonance or in this molecular relations and molecular heroism, even molecular maybe revolution, with the works of Guattari and Gilles Deleuze? Or I'm asking you because I know that you know very well all of these authors, and I am curious about that.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, go please.
It's okay. I have this book that will be published in September, which you mentioned, on Deleuze, Bergson, and Merleau-Ponty, and I pick up this kind of problem there in the chapters on Merleau-Ponty. And of course, I was drawn to understanding what Merleau-Ponty means by molecular and molar, because he uses the language. And no one that I know of in Merleau-Ponty studies had talked about it. And I have to say that it's definitely not the same as what Deleuze and Guattari are doing. And that has to do with the overall structure. I think it's quite possible that what I have said about Saint-Exupéry is much closer to Deleuze than Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty still, right, the anonymous body, which always has intrigued me, It's always an idea that I've found really interesting in Merleau-Ponty. It remains part of these structures, the physical, the biological, and the mental. And what I want in addition to that, right, is a molecular that that can be characterized by the idea of chaos. Chaos doesn't mean just crazy, as you know. Chaos means very sensitive to initial conditions, sensitivity to initial conditions. So even a very small change in initial conditions can have a tremendously different outcome, right? Depending on exactly what those initial conditions are, even the smallest change. So there's no one history. There isn't a single history for us to absorb in any way, shape, or form. There's a multiplicity of them. And therefore, when we ground our social and political disputes in the idea that there's one history, we end up with the kind of mess that we're in around the world right now, There isn't, right? Chaos implies a multiplicity of different starting points, each of which goes in a different direction. So each of us are, the history we get is not even just one, it's multiple. We have multiple histories, right? And each of those multiple histories goes or develops in a different way, not only from person to person, but even within the same person. And so, the idea of rigid political orders and rigid political categories and social categories becomes more and more of a problem. I hope that answers the question. I would think this is a little closer to what Deleuze and Guattari were after, especially Guattari. But Deleuze embraced these ideas fully from Guattari. There's no question in my mind. I also don't think that Deleuze has a solution, by the way. I think he opens some doors that are very interesting, but I don't think Deleuze has a complete solution either. But he does open some interesting ways of thinking, some new ways of thinking about these problems. I don't think I think we have a long way to go before we can think multiplicity in any real way, chaos, before we can really think chaos as sensitivity to initial starting points and a multiplicity of different trajectories. That's even more than differentiation. Or, Deleuze-Guattari's différence. So we have a lot of work to do still.
I would ask why we need heroes. And I don't know if there's an answer. Even in philosophy, we are still looking for heroes. To Sartre, the hero is the writer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because the idea of the hero is, you hear it all the time in the United States. It makes me crazy. And that was one of the reasons I addressed this issue, because I can't stand it, Everyone is, all these special people, they're heroes. And if you ask them, are you a hero? Usually they say, I'm not a hero. I was just doing my job. I was doing the right thing, or I was following the trajectory based on what I know or what I was asked to do. Just like Saint-Exupéry, He didn't say, I'm going to go up in this plane and be a hero. He said, okay, that's my job. I'm going to go do it. That's the way it is mostly. We do our job, and the use of this word hero just makes it's infuriating to me. So I think that's part of the reason why I'm glad that Merleau-Ponty questions it, but I agree with you. I don't think we need this. It's not helpful.
Cool.
Agora eu retorno aqui. Eu só quero ver se o meu som está saindo. Agora eu retorno aqui. Ok, eu vou fazer uma breve tradução dessas duas últimas questões. Eu perguntei se o termo molecular, bastante usado no texto dela, tinha alguma ressonância, interface, mesmo diferença com o termo utilizado principalmente pelo Guattari e junto do Deleuze, né, Guattari. E ela me disse que a princípio não, embora não há uma ressonância total, né? E que, na verdade, o que a gente poderia, procurando uma aproximação possível, é reencontrar esta dificuldade de princípio em todas as nossas tentativas, tanto de totalizar quanto de antecipar a história e mesmo nós mesmos, porque ela diz, existe uma multiplicidade de tempos e de histórias, que o termo molecular e esse aspecto eminentemente caótico da nossa vida traz à tona. Existe uma multiplicidade da história que deve nuançar, deve nortear e também relativizar na medida do possível a política, e existe uma multiplicidade de acontecimentos, de ocorrências, mesmo no nível do indivíduo, não apenas no coletivo da história. Para ela, o Deleuze desenvolve, sim, essa questão do regime molecular do sentido, né? Ele muito mais pega do Guattari do que ele mesmo desenvolve, e ela crê que, embora essas questões são inacabadas, como ela vai terminar na resposta dela, que o Deleuze não tem uma solução para este caos que, em certa medida, governa a nossa vida, mas como ela frisa bem, o caos não é bagunça, o caos não é nada, não se trata de pensar isso, né? Mas como existe essa complexidade, multiplicidade constitutiva de todas as nossas experiências, né? Então, o que acontece? Uma certa sensibilidade para essas multiplicidades de pontos de vista é preciso desenvolver, e ela desenvolve em vários dos trabalhos dela, e ela só nota isso, que ainda há muito a ser feito, há muito trabalho a ser feito. Com relação à pergunta da Luísa, eu acho que eu não peguei muito bem a resposta, porque eu estava respondendo aqui no chat. A Luísa perguntou a respeito, novamente, a figura do herói, que não só para o Merleau-Ponty, também no Sartre ela aparece na figura do escritor, né? E por que nós precisaríamos de herói? Por exemplo, em Sartre, a figura do escritor. E eu acho que eu não peguei essa resposta, gente, me desculpem por não traduzir, ela foi mais rápida enquanto eu escrevi aqui para resolver os problemas de quem não conseguiu preencher ou não conseguiu atestar a presença pelo formulário, pode enviar um e-mail para nós com todas as suas informações, porque o formulário está dando problema em alguns navegadores, então pode enviar o e-mail para nós e eu fico devendo essa resposta, mas como vai estar na internet, tudo que eu errei aqui, mais por culpa minha que estou transmitindo do que da Luísa, vai ficar para a eternidade, assim como essa maravilhosa palestra que eu queria agradecer antes da Luísa encerrar, por favor. Thank you again, Professor, for your kind acceptation of our invitation and delight us with your presence, lecture, and wisdom. I can say, thank you very much.
I'm very happy to have met you, and I know that situation in your country is difficult, and I do wish you all to be good, okay. And I think about you and I worry about you. So I hope you will all be okay.
Thank you very much. We're very glad to hear you, to have you. And I wish you the best. Obrigada a todos. Thank you. Obrigada a todos que estiveram conosco nessa manhã. Nós lamentamos profundamente os problemas técnicos que tivemos. No entanto, isso ultrapassa os nossos poderes e o nosso conhecimento. Encerramos essa primeira mesa do dia 24, a quarta mesa do nosso ciclo de conferências, e convidamos a todos para estarem conosco à tarde, com a presença ilustre também do professor Etienne Bambenet, e menos ilustre a minha conferência também. Obrigada a todos e até mais. Thank you, Dorothea. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.